I stood in the shadows near the service entrance of the Grand Plaza Ballroom, holding a glass of club soda I had no intention of drinking. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, seared beef, and the fragile confidence of people who lived and died by quarterly projections. At the front of the hall, standing beneath a massive crystal chandelier that vibrated with the bass of the live band, was Julian Thorne. He was 62 years old, had silver hair that looked like it had been sculpted by a team of public relations experts, and wore a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than most of our warehouse coordinators earned in a year. Julian raised his hands to quiet the crowd. Beside him stood his son, Preston Thorne, who was 28, wore an equally expensive suit and had the smug, restless look of a man who had never had to wait in line for anything in his entire life. Julian tapped his glass, the sound echoing through the speaker system. For the last 14 months, Summit Logistics has undergone a remarkable transformation, Julian announced, his voice smooth and polished. We went from the brink of insolvency to recording our highest-performing year in company history. Many people worked tireless hours, and I want to acknowledge the technical work done by Harvey Vance. A polite, brief ripple of applause swept through the room. A few colleagues glanced back toward me, but I remained still. I was 48 years old, wore a plain gray suit that had seen too many system outage nights, and knew exactly what was coming next. Julian did not invite me to the stage. Instead, he smiled at his son. But as we move into our next phase of expansion, we need visionary leadership that looks beyond the technical details. We need presence, passion, and a perspective that can carry us into the future. Effective immediately, Preston Thorne will be assuming the role of Director of Operations, taking over all responsibilities for our core systems. The applause this time was louder, driven by the board members and executives who knew which way the wind was blowing. Preston stepped forward, shaking his father's hand and nodding to the crowd with a practiced humility that fooled no one who actually worked for a living. He went on for another 10 minutes, speaking about market share, synergies, and strategic positioning. He used all the standard industry jargon that executives love to repeat when they want to sound like they are actively managing a company rather than just sitting at the top of a pyramid built on the labor of hundreds of underpaid employees. The crowd drank their expensive champagne and nodded along, eager to stay in the CEO's good graces. I did not applaud. I set my glass down on a waiter's tray and walked out of the ballroom, down the quiet marble corridor toward the executive wing. I knew Julian's habits. I knew he would leave the party early to check the overnight shipping manifests from his desk, wanting to see the numbers that my software had generated. I waited in the hallway outside his office for 10 minutes until I heard his footsteps. Julian arrived alone, his tie slightly loosened, looking pleased with himself. "Harvey," he said, stopping when he saw me, "I was hoping to catch you. That was a good presentation, was it not?" I followed him into his office, closing the heavy mahogany door behind me. The click of the latch sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. "You told me that results were the only currency that mattered at Summit," I said, keeping my voice level and quiet. "You know who rebuilt the infrastructure. You know Preston does not even know how to query the databases." Julian sat down behind his desk, leaning back in his leather chair. He did not look angry. He looked amused. "You did a fine job, Harvey," he said, "but you are a technician. You build things in dark rooms. Preston is a Thorne. He understands the bigger picture. He has the pedigree to speak to our major investors. You have been compensated for your work." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick leather wallet, and extracted a single crisp bill. He slid it across the polished desk. It was a $100 bill. "This is a small bonus," Julian said, tapping the paper with his finger. "Consider it a token of my personal appreciation. It represents what your individual contribution is actually worth to this firm now that the system is stable. Take it, Harvey. Be sensible." I looked at the bill. It lay there under the soft desk lamp. A clean piece of paper that was worth less than the coffee I had consumed during the 72-hour database recovery marathon 3 months ago. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I reached out, picked up the bill, folded it in half, and placed it inside my jacket pocket. "Thank you, Julian," I said. He looked slightly surprised by my lack of resistance, perhaps even disappointed that I had not given him an excuse to raise his voice. "That is it then," he said, waving a hand. "We will see you on Monday." I turned and walked out. He thought I was accepting his terms. He thought I was acknowledging my place as a replaceable cog in his machine. What Julian Thorne did not know was that the bill in my pocket was the most expensive mistake he would ever make. He believed that Summit Logistics owned the engine that kept their trucks moving, their warehouses sorting, and their clients happy. He was about to find out that they were only renting it, and the lease was about to expire. To understand how we arrived at this point, you have to understand the absolute disaster. Summit Logistics was when I walked through their doors 14 months ago. They were a mid-tier freight forwarding and third-party logistics company that had grown too fast, chasing national contracts while relying on spreadsheet systems and outdated database software from the late 90s. Every day was a crisis. Shipments were routinely lost in transit. Warehouse dispatchers were manually calling truck drivers to confirm arrival times, and billing errors occurred on nearly 40% of our invoices. We were losing our three largest retail distribution accounts, which represented over $6 million in annual revenue. The board of directors was in a state of constant panic, and Julian Thorne was 1 month away from having to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy. When Julian first brought me in, he offered me a standard executive salary and a promise of stock options that would likely have been worthless by the end of the year. I refused. I had spent 25 years in the software industry, and I had seen too many developers write brilliant systems only to be laid off the moment the code was stable. I told Julian that I would not join Summit Logistics as an employee. Instead, my company, Vance Systems LLC, would design, build, and license a custom logistics optimization framework specifically for Summit. We called the system SummitFlow. It was a proprietary engine that integrated real-time GPS tracking, automated warehouse inventory allocation, and client-facing predictive delivery forecasting. I spent the first 90 days working 18-hour days, sitting in a windowless cubicle next to the server room, listening to the complaints of dispatchers like Clara Dixon, who was 42 and had spent years manually correcting system errors. Clara would show me spreadsheets that had been copied and pasted so many times that the formulas were completely broken, resulting in trucks being sent to the wrong warehouses or drivers being scheduled for 24-hour shifts without their knowledge. The database was a nightmare of unindexed tables and conflicting entries that had been piled on top of each other since the early years of the company. It was a miracle the system had not crashed permanently before I arrived. I watched how the data flowed, identified the bottlenecks, and slowly wrote the core code that would replace their broken infrastructure. Julian Thorne was desperate. He signed our master software licensing agreement without reading the details, leaving his legal department to handle the boilerplate while he focused on pacifying angry investors. He did not care about the architecture. He only cared that the system worked and that his company stopped bleeding money. But my legal consultant and I had drafted the contract with extreme care. We included specific protections to ensure that Vance Systems LLC retained full ownership of the intellectual property, and that I would maintain absolute control over the operational deployment. That protection was written into Appendix C, Section 3.7 of our agreement. The clause was clear. If Summit Logistics materially altered the operational oversight of Vance Systems LLC or replaced the designated lead architect without a mutual written amendment signed by both parties, the software license would immediately transition into a restricted read-only mode. During this transition, which would last for exactly 30 days, the system would allow existing data to be viewed but would block all new entry creation, automated scheduling, and database modifications. If no remediation agreement was signed within those 30 days, the license would terminate completely, and the software would shut down. Julian's lawyers had raised a brief objection to the clause during negotiations, but I remained firm. I told them that if they wanted a custom system that could rescue their business within weeks, they had to accept that the architect controlled the ignition. Desperate to keep their largest retail clients from walking away, Julian overruled his legal team and signed the document. Over the next 12 months, SummitFlow performed exactly as I had promised. The error rate in shipping fell to less than half of 1%. Warehouse efficiency increased by 50%. Clara Dixon and her team went from crying in the break room to managing twice the volume of shipments with half the stress. The $6 million in threatened revenue was saved, and we signed 4 new national distribution accounts worth an additional $8 million. In the industry journals, Julian Thorne was praised as a turnaround genius, a visionary leader who had modernized a traditional logistics firm. In reality, the entire company was running on a software engine that verified its license key against the Vance Systems server every 60 seconds. I had spent a year building a masterpiece, but I had also built a lock. And Julian, in his arrogance, had just handed me the key. The trouble began 3 months before the anniversary party, when Preston Thorne was appointed as a special consultant to the board. Fresh out of business school and eager to prove that he possessed his father's supposed business acumen, Preston immediately began interfering in our daily operations. He had no understanding of database design, API integrations, or supply chain queue mechanics. To him, SummitFlow was simply a collection of colorful dashboards that he could show to potential investors. He wanted to make the interface look flashier, suggesting that we eliminate several critical security and validation checks to make the user experience faster. I refused. I told him that those validation checks were the only thing preventing our warehouse databases from corrupting during peak hours. Preston did not appreciate being corrected by an external contractor. He went to his father, complaining that I was old-fashioned, resistant to change, and hindering the modernization of the firm. Julian Thorne, eager to pave the way for his son's eventual succession, began to quietly sideline me. I found myself excluded from weekly strategy meetings that I had previously led. Emails regarding operational changes were sent to Preston instead of me, and decisions that affected our core databases were made without my input. The final straw came during our preparations for the annual audit by our largest retail client, a national department store chain that represented nearly $10 million in annual shipments. Preston decided to push a major software update 2 days before the audit was scheduled to begin, bypassing our standard testing protocols. When I pointed out in a meeting that doing so risked a complete system failure during the audit, Julian cut me off. "We need to move quickly, Harvey," Julian said. "We cannot let your technical caution paralyze our progress. Preston has the board's backing on this." Preston wanted to impress the auditing team by showing them a new animated dispatch map that he had hired an external graphic designer to create. He did not care that the map interface was completely unconnected to our real-time GPS tracking database, or that pushing his unverified code would disrupt our automated API calls. To him, as long as the screen looked pretty for the auditors, the underlying mechanics were irrelevant. I looked around the room, but the other executives looked down at their notebooks. They knew who held the power. Tobias Miller, a 31-year-old developer who worked under my supervision, stopped by my desk later that afternoon. He looked nervous, checking over his shoulder before speaking to me. "Harvey, you need to see this," Tobias whispered, sliding a USB drive onto my desk. I was cleaning up the shared network drive in the executive folder, and I found a scanned document. It is a signed addendum to your original contract. I plugged the drive into my laptop and opened the file. It was a PDF titled Intellectual Property Assignment Addendum. The document stated that Vance Systems LLC had agreed to transfer all rights, title, and interest in the SummitFlow software to Summit Logistics in exchange for a one-time payment of $50,000. At the bottom of the page were 2 signatures, Julian Thorne on behalf of Summit Logistics, and my signature on behalf of Vance Systems LLC. My jaw clenched as I stared at the signature. It was a copy of my signature, taken from one of our monthly invoice approvals and digitally pasted onto the contract. I had never seen this document before. I had certainly never signed it, and Vance Systems LLC had never received any payment of $50,000. Julian and Preston had forged my signature to convince the board of directors and the auditing team that Summit Logistics owned the software outright. They believed that by creating this fraudulent document, they could terminate my contract, put Preston in charge of the operations, and avoid triggering the license restriction clause in Appendix C. They thought they had found a shortcut to steal my life's work. What they did not realize was that they had committed a felony under California Penal Code Section 470, which governs forgery. In the United States legal system, a contract that contains a forged signature is not merely voidable, it is void ab initio, meaning it is invalid from its very inception. It has no legal standing, confers no rights, and cannot be enforced by any court. Because the forged addendum was void ab initio, our original contract remained fully in force. And under that original contract, Summit Logistics was still operating under a license that was strictly tied to my role as lead architect. By announcing my replacement at the anniversary party, Julian Thorne had legally triggered the license restriction. They had tried to steal my software using a forged document, but all they had done was walk themselves directly into a legal and operational trap. I spent Saturday morning at my kitchen table preparing the digital transition sequence. I did not need to hack their servers or delete their databases. I simply opened the Vance Systems licensing console and updated the status of Summit's account. I uploaded a copy of the original signed contract and initiated the 24-hour countdown for the read-only transition. Julian and Preston thought they had successfully pushed me out of the company with a $100 insult. They were about to learn that you cannot run a modern logistics empire on a foundation built of lies and forged signatures. On Monday morning at 9 o'clock, the trap snapped shut. I sat in a coffee shop across the street from the Summit Logistics headquarters, watching the office workers hurry through the glass doors. On my tablet, I monitored the server logs. At exactly 9 o'clock, the 24-hour countdown expired, and Summit Flow transitioned into read-only mode. 10 minutes later, the first signs of trouble appeared on the street outside. A line of commercial delivery trucks began to form near the loading docks, their engines idling as drivers waited for their dispatch manifests. Inside the building, the operations floor was descending into chaos. Clara Dixon and her team of dispatchers were trying to enter new shipping manifests, but every time they clicked the save button, the screen flashed a red warning message: Lines, status, read only. Database modification disabled. Contact Vance Systems LLC. Without the ability to write new data, the system could not generate routing schedules, assign drivers, or process client billing. The entire shipping engine was frozen in time. Clara Dixon tried to organize a manual dispatch protocol, instructing her team to write down the shipment numbers and destination addresses on paper pads. But they quickly realized the futility of the exercise. With over 5,000 shipments moving through our network every single day, trying to manage the routing and driver assignments manually was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. Within 30 minutes, the phones were ringing off the hook as drivers demanded directions and customers demanded updates. At 9:15, my phone rang. It was Julian Thorne. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Amelia," he barked, calling me by the name of the previous COO before correcting himself. "Harvey, what is going on? The systems are down. Our drivers cannot load their trucks. What did you do?" "Good morning, Julian," I replied calmly. "The system is not down. It is performing exactly as designed. Your license transitioned to read-only mode at 9 o'clock this morning." "What do you mean by that?" Julian shouted. "We own this software. We signed an addendum. If you are trying to hold our systems hostage, I will have our legal department file a lawsuit before noon." "You do not own the software, Julian," I said. "And if you consult your legal department, I suggest you ask them about the document you uploaded to the shared network drive. The one titled Intellectual Property Assignment Addendum." Silence hung on the line for several seconds. I could hear Preston's voice in the background, whispering frantically. "We have a signed agreement, Harvey," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. "You signed it. We have your signature on file." "That signature is a forgery, Julian," I said. "I never saw that document, and I never signed it. You copied my signature from an invoice and pasted it onto that contract to show your board. That is a violation of California Penal Code Section 470. Under United States contract law, a forged agreement is void ab initio. It has zero legal validity. It is as if the document never existed." Julian exhaled sharply. "You cannot prove that," he muttered. "I do not need to prove it to you, Julian," I replied. My digital forensic consultant has already analyzed the PDF and confirmed the signature metadata matches an invoice from 6 months ago. Because that addendum is void ab initio, our original licensing agreement is the only valid contract. And under Appendix C, Section 3.7, replacing me as lead architect without my written consent triggers immediate license restriction. You announced Preston as my replacement on Friday night. The system did exactly what it was contracted to do. Listen to me, Harvey, Julian said, trying to sound authoritative. We have over 200 delivery trucks waiting at our warehouses. We are losing $50,000 every hour this system is frozen. Tell me how to bypass this lock. You cannot bypass it, I said. The license validation key is hosted on the Vance Systems secure cloud server. Every transaction is cryptographically signed. If you attempt to alter the local code, the database will lock permanently to prevent corruption. Tobias Miller already knows this. He is currently standing behind you, and he will tell you that any attempt to force the system open will result in total data loss. In the background, I heard Preston shouting at Tobias, demanding that he find a way around the lock. Tobias's response was faint but clear. I cannot do it, Preston. It is a remote validation key. If we try to bypass it, we are violating federal copyright law under Title 17, United States Code, Section 501. The company could face hundreds of thousands of dollars in statutory damages. Julian spoke back into the receiver. What do you want, Harvey? We can discuss a transition package. I am not interested in a transition package, I said. You wanted to show the board that your son was ready to lead. Let him lead. Let him explain to our clients why their shipments are sitting on the loading docks. If you want to discuss a real solution, I will be at the conference room in boardroom B at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Bring your board members and your lead counsel. Do not bring Preston unless he is prepared to remain silent. I hung up before he could reply. I ordered another cup of coffee and watched the queue of trucks grow longer. For the first time in 14 months, I did not have to fix their problems. They had created this crisis themselves, and they were finally going to have to pay the true price of their arrogance. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I walked into boardroom B. The atmosphere in the room was cold and tense. Julian Thorne was sitting at the head of the conference table, his collar open and his hair no longer looking perfectly styled. Preston Thorne paced near the window, his arms crossed, looking furious. Two senior board members sat silently on the other side of the table, while the company's chief legal officer, Victoria Finch, sat with a thick folder of contract documents on the table. The large windows of the boardroom overlooked the shipping lanes of the harbor, where several of our clients' container ships were currently sitting at anchor waiting for the logistics coordinates that our system had failed to deliver. The room felt small and suffocating, filled with the quiet panic of wealthy people who were realizing that their titles and financial assets were completely useless without the technical system that made them run. I walked to the center of the table and did not sit down immediately. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the folded $100 bill, and placed it in the center of the polished wood table. "What is that?" Preston snapped, his voice sharp with frustration. "That," I said, looking directly at Julian, "is what your father told me my contribution was worth to this firm. $100. A tip for saving a company from bankruptcy." Julian did not look at the bill. He looked at me, his eyes tired. "Let us get to the point, Harvey," he said. "Our clients are calling every 10 minutes. If we cannot process new orders by tomorrow morning, our largest retail account will terminate their agreement. The board wants this resolved." I sat down, leaning back. "The resolution is simple," I said. "First, you will sign a formal declaration acknowledging that the intellectual property assignment addendum is null and void. You will admit in writing that Vance Systems LLC retains sole ownership of the Summit Flow software and that my signature on that document was forged without my knowledge or consent. Victoria Finch has already reviewed the metadata. She knows that if this goes to a federal court under a copyright infringement lawsuit, Summit Logistics will lose its operating license entirely." Victoria Finch nodded slowly. "He is correct, Julian," she said quietly. "If Vance Systems LLC files a copyright infringement suit under Title 17 United States Code, Section 501, The court will issue an immediate injunction. We would have to shut down all operations within 24 hours. Furthermore, a forgery investigation under California Penal Code, Section 470, exposes the firm to massive criminal liability. Preston stepped forward, his face red. We cannot let him dictate terms to us. We can hire another firm to build a replacement. It would take you at least 20 months and cost $5 million to build a system of this scale from scratch, I replied, looking at the board members. And during those 20 months, you would have no system to run your business. Your clients would leave within 20 days. The senior board member, a man who had remained quiet until now, reached across the table, took the $100 bill, and slid it back toward Julian. We are not going to destroy a $100 million logistics firm over a personal dispute, the board member said. Harvey, what are your operational terms? First, I said, Vance Systems LLC will sign a new 5-year licensing and maintenance agreement with Summit Logistics. The licensing fee will be adjusted to market rate, which is double the original agreement. Second, I will be reinstated as the chief systems architect with complete operational control over Summit Flow. Any changes to my authority will require my explicit written consent. Third, Preston Thorne will be removed from all operational roles. He can have a title in strategic initiatives, but he will not have access to our servers, databases, or development teams. If he touches the system, the license will lock automatically. Preston opened his mouth to protest, but Julian held up his hand, silencing his son. Is that everything? Julian asked. Yes, I said. Once the contract is signed, I will restore database access. The trucks can start moving in 30 minutes. Victoria Finch opened her folder and pulled out the prepared documents. She had spent the last 3 hours drafting the new licensing agreement based on the terms I had sent over earlier. Julian Thorne read the pages slowly, his pen hovering over the signature line. He looked up at me one last time, perhaps hoping to find some room for compromise, but he found none. He signed the contract, followed by the board members. I took my copy of the signed agreement, stood up, and opened my tablet. With 3 clicks, I restored full access to the Summit Flow server. Within minutes, the notifications began to flash on my screen as new manifests were processed, and the queue of waiting trucks started to clear. I picked up the $100 bill from the table. Keep it, Julian said quietly. It belongs to you. I intend to, I replied. I walked out of the boardroom and down the elevator. I did not return to my cubicle. I went home, slept for 8 hours, and on Tuesday morning I returned to the office as an independent partner, not a subordinate. I took the $100 bill, framed it in glass, and hung it on the wall of my study. It serves as a reminder. It reminds me that your value is not what someone else chooses to pay you in a moment of arrogance. Your value is the leverage you build quietly, the systems you design that no one else can run, and the contracts you read when everyone else is looking at the signature line. The Thorne family tried to replace me with a name and a title, but they discovered that names do not write code, and titles do not move freight. In the end, respect is not given, it is contractually enforced.